Hello. As an alum, it is my absolute pleasure to invite you to this 150th anniversary event. My name is Hillary Brill, and I lead Georgetown's Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, where we focus on issues at the intersection of public interest, technology, policy, and the law. Issues such as those central to today's book launch of Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping Democracy and Our Lives. We're so pleased at the Institute to be putting on this event in collaboration with Common Sense Media. The book, with essays by some of our panelists, explores how technologies have impacted conversations about our children's well being, racial divides in America, and basically what it means to do good in this world. These conversations about how technology shapes our lives and our world and how we shape it back are central to so much of our work here at the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. In the 4 years since its founding, the Institute has taken a leading role in conversations like this one, and also about algorithmic fairness, content moderation, civil rights, and privacy. It is my pleasure to turn over this event now to the Dean of our law school, Dean Trainor, who had the foresight to establish the Tech Institute and is the reason we're here today to discuss critical issues at the forefront of technology, policy, and society. Dean Trainor has been dedicated to pursuing public interest technology issues and helped develop the novel new Georgetown-wide initiative for tech and society. And also, he developed our new Masters in Law and Technology program. I am, again, proud as an alum to be leading one of the greatest tech institutes in this country. And with that, please welcome Dean Trainor.
Well, thank you very much, Hillary. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And it's a privilege for me to welcome everyone to the book launch of Which Side of History. And we're so pleased to be co-hosting this great event with Common Sense Media and have such an amazing panel of speakers. So we're going to have for you today Professor Julie Cohen, who's the Mark Mamelin Professor of Law and Technology at Georgetown, the faculty director of the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, and the author of several books on how technology is reshaping the law and legal institutions. We'll be hearing from Bruce Reed, the co-founder and CEO of Civic, the former chief of staff to President-elect Biden, Vice President Biden at the time, and a leading technology policy advisor to the Biden team. We'll be hearing from Jim Steyer. Jim is the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media. He's done great work to protect children's privacy. And he's the editor of the book we're going to be talking about today, Which Side of History. So welcome, Jim. It's great to have you here. We'll be hearing from Senator Mark Warner, U.S. Senator from Virginia and Vice Chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. So it's a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous panel. And I'd particularly like to recognize and make a special welcome to April McLean Delaney, who's our moderator. April is a graduate of Georgetown Law, class of '89. She's the director of Common Sense Washington, D.C. And she is a former chair of the Board of Visitors at Georgetown Law, a member of the board. And she's somebody who, I've looked to as such a guide and has really helped me think through where we should be focusing as a law school, and particularly in the technology area. So I'm just absolutely delighted that April is here and will be our moderator. And, as Hillary said, this is part of our 150th anniversary. The Georgetown Law School started in 1870. And so we had planned to have a great year of festivities. The pandemic has altered in a lot of ways what this year looks like. So as you're looking at me, you can see me with the Georgetown Law 150th anniversary banner. I am broadcasting live from my son Liam's bedroom. And we also have these bookcases in case I'm ever on television and there's Rate My Room. I want to do well, so it's there, and it's a very impressive collection of books. So it's not exactly what we envisioned our 150th would look like, but what we've done is we've taken really, among other things, extraordinary academic programs, and we've brought them online. And one of the things that I've just been very aware of is the way in which we're actually able to reach new and different audiences. So it's a way of getting out our message that has been so powerful. And when we thought about what we want to have as our showcase events, we wanted to do something like this, something that celebrates our work in technology, law, and policy. Georgetown Law is at the leading edge of privacy and cybersecurity. I don't think anybody really, if they're being honest, would be able to say that any school other than Georgetown is number one in law and technology. I think, that's just true. We have so many wonderful centers and institutes at the Law Center, but we're especially proud of the work of the Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. As you heard from Hillary, what the center is doing is really amazing. And it's having great programs. We're number one. You're absolutely right, April. So, we have terrific programs like this one. And we're also educating the next generation of leaders. So I'm particularly proud, as Hillary mentioned, this year we started an LLM in technology, law, and policy. And we have a program for lawyers and we have a program for engineers. So we're really in every way shaping the conversation. And that makes so much sense because, Georgetown Law is a school that is really has focused since our start 150 years ago on justice and on civil rights. And so many of the big issues in justice, in civil rights, are at the intersection of law and technology. And so that's really, what we're going to be talking about today. And it just makes sense that a school that's focused on justice, focused on technology, brings them together. So we're going to be talking today about questions that are at that interface, like what is the role of government with respect to online platforms and speech? How can we ensure that everyone has equal and fair access to information and new technologies? What can we do to make sure that the vulnerable populations are protected from online harms? And what effect are new communication technologies having on our society and on our democracy? They are some of the biggest issues of the day. We're going to be grappling with them. It's an amazing panel. Thank you very much for being part of this conversation. And let me turn matters over. And again, I just really want to thank, as we focused on law and technology, April has been such a big part about shaping where we go. So it's perfect on the 150th anniversary where we bring together this amazing panel that April is moderating. So April Delaney.
Well, God bless you. Thank you so much, Dean Traynor, and congratulations on your interactive set of dialogues for Georgetown's 150th. I'm thrilled. There's so many alums like myself, current law students, and national thought leaders on. We have over 400 people on this book launch, which I think is amazing. Also, thanks to Hillary Brill and Jeff Gary at the Institute, as well as Professor Julie Cohen for her legal insights, which she's very infamous and famous around the school. But being a book launch, I want to especially welcome our three authors, Senator Mark Warren, Jim Steyer, and Bruce Reed. And this is the book you need to buy. And there is a link, I believe, underneath in your chat. So, but giving due credit to where due credit is due, Jim Steyer is the founder of Common Sense Media and the architect of this book. And it's an important read. And I say it's an important read because it's actually a collection of 52 essays from an incredibly diverse set of authors, researchers, politicians, business leaders, journalists, about how technology is shaping and reshaping every aspect of our world, socially, economically, and politically, but also in terms of individually, our privacy and our own mental health and our physical well-being. I well remember when I first started at Common Sense Media back in 2006, Jim Steyer at a local DC school held up a cell phone and he said, "Just wait, parents. This is going to be a computer in your kids' pockets." And everyone kind of, None of us really understood back then what that meant, but we're now definitely reaping the consequences from a technological revolution. And our three co-authors today have really focused their essays on how social media platforms have the ability to increasingly facilitate hate speech, amplify misinformation and violence, and undermine trust in our democracy. And you know what, these issues seem to have only been exacerbated in an election year when COVID-19 hit and when we've had a national movement for racial justice. All three call for reform of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Now, that's a comprehensive liability shield enacted by Congress during a time of really dial-up AOL. Reed and Steyer point out that the original intent behind the enactment of 230 was really to protect companies who were trying to really do the right thing as good Samaritans in moderating content that did not meet their guidelines. However, the act also incentivized a different outcome, such that many companies are now profiting from and are incentivized to have no accountability for some of that content posted by its users. Senator Warren, who's a former businessman and tech guy, now writes this hands-off regulatory approach has resulted in part on an assault on our democracy. But the last thing I have to say, and echoing the dean's comments this morning, reading a lot of articles about 230, I think we have to proceed with caution in over politicizing Section 213. Key in my reflection is that I don't believe that those who legislate and advocate and adjudicate want to facilitate bad actors who not only engage in bad or illegal behavior online, and there should be no form of redress. However, we don't want to stop innovation or creativity or freedom of expression, and therein lies the rub. So perhaps this discussion also lifts up holistically to see the interconnection of not only these two essays, but all the other 50 and how they interconnect and how we can bend technology to better, lift up and to better off our society. And for those Georgetown Law students and alums listening in, know that social justice and social service are a part of our ethos. And as the dean said, our motto is law is but the means, but justice is the ends. So congratulations, Dean, and let's get on with the discussion. So I'm going to start off with Jim Steyer because he is the architect. So Jim, you're the founder of Common Sense Media. I worked with you for a long time and the author of several books on media's impact. What spurred you to do this collaborative book project and how did it come together? And why is it so important now?
Well, first of all, April, thank you so much. And as Dean Traynor said, you have been an incredible force, not just at Georgetown Law, but across this country. My friend Mark Warner knows that. Professor Cohen knows that. We're so happy to be here with you. But I think basically it's because we are at this absolutely critical moment in terms of technology's impact on all of our lives. And by the way, having Senator Warner here is great because he was a major player in the technology industry before he became a political leader. And he and Bruce Reed and I have had many discussions about how we deal with all this. So this is such a fun event. But bottom line is this, we all know, and the pandemic has made this even more clear, technology is everywhere in our lives 24/7. And as you know, April, Common Sense is the biggest kids advocacy group in the country. So from a kid's standpoint, anybody out there who's a parent or a grandparent knows what's going on with their kids trying to do distance learning or not able to be out with their friends or just survive this extraordinary time. And technology is everywhere. And quite frankly, over the past decade or 15 years, it's become increasingly dominated by a handful of huge companies. Which have revolutionized our lives, revolutionized our economy, are literally the biggest companies in the world and probably in American history in terms of both economic might and pure power. And I think what happened was after conversations with people like Mark Warner and Bruce Reed and some of the other folks in the book like Mike Bloomberg or Mark Benioff from the business world, or ironically Sacha Baron Cohen, Aaron Sorkin out of the entertainment industry, or some of the really great experts in the country on politics, or some of the people who basically helped found our whole internet world, it became clear that there was a fundamental question that we ought to ask the people who run the big tech companies, which is, which side of history are you on? Because you're shaping our lives whether we like it or not. And the question is, in terms of our kids, in terms of our democracy, in terms of our social norms, you have unparalleled power. And the idea was get the 52 smartest people we know to write, who have experience in this field, to write pieces. That was the basic idea. And thank God the product turned out to be better than we thought it could have been. And I think and I'm really interested to hear from Senator Warner about this, from Julie Cohen about this, and Bruce, if he can join us. He's with President-elect Biden right now, and he's gonna cut in hopefully in a few minutes. we are at this incredible inflection point, a transformational moment about how we should both regulate and legislate when it comes to technology. And April, as you know, and as Senator Warner knows, we passed the landmark privacy law in the United States is not a federal law, it's a California state law. And that's which we passed in 2018, which Common Sense authored and passed in 2018. It's similar to the GDPR law in Europe. And the reason we did it was because at that point, Washington, D.C. was not acting on these issues in the same way. And it was critical that we passed a law in the place where all the tech companies are centered, California, that could do it. But I think we're at this point where 2021, literally, I think early January, February 2021, we're going to start to see major changes in the way that we as a society, but also that our political and legislative structures look at technology. So it's a pretty simple question. Which side of history do you want to be on? And I say that to Tim Cook. I say that to Mark Zuckerberg. I say that to Satya Nadella at Microsoft, to Sundar and Ruth at Google, Jeff Bezos at Amazon, and all the other folks, big and small, who are shaping our reality. And so couldn't be more excited to talk about that. And also to lay out for you what I think is a really thoughtful, comprehensive agenda about how we can change technology for the better so that it serves all Americans, all kids and families. Also, as Senator Warner knows, protects our intelligence efforts and our impact from foreign powers who've tried to subvert our democracy at times. So we're at this hugely transformational moment and couldn't be more happy to have a discussion with you, April, and everybody else who's here. So thanks.
Jim, I'm going to ask you one follow-up question. I was going to ask it and have Bruce chime in, but in your essay, I hear the bigger of the 52 essays, and I agree, we have to reshape technology and lift up to do the most, but you argue that these social media platforms really need to be more accountable and that big tech makes platforms, profits off these platforms that amplify or do things. You and others have proposed this safe harbor for reasonable efforts to moderate content. Can you just tell me what a little bit that looks like on a high level?
Sure. And, it's interesting because I've had this conversation with Senator Warner. I'm looking at him smiling because we've had this conversation. Bruce and I and Mark have had this conversation any number of times. Because I look at Section 230, I'm going to say that as sort of a get out of jail free card for all the big tech companies. And it clearly wasn't designed by Mark Warner's colleague, Ron Wyden, that way when they wrote the provision in 1996. But the fact that, and hello, John Delaney, one of my favorite people of all time. Hello. But Section 230 was not designed that. It was, as you said, April, to open up the internet and protect people who were allowing user-generated content on their platform. It has become, however, a blanket shield of immunity for the major tech companies. And we've been particularly critical of companies like Facebook and Instagram, and to a lesser extent, I'd say YouTube, who have repeatedly amplified misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, anti-Semitic and racist arguments, et cetera. There's a piece in the book by the actor Sacha Baron Cohen, who ironically has been a huge activist on these issues because he's been the subject of so many anti-Semitic attacks, so many hate speech attacks, et cetera. Obviously, he's also a big believer in free speech and the First Amendment, or he wouldn't make movies like Borat. But that said, we are at this point where a handful of platforms, particularly the social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram, have repeatedly amplified messages and false information that have undermined our democracy, undermined basic norms and institutions, are doing that today, by the way, are literally doing that today, have spread misinformation about COVID-19, have through algorithmically driven platforms amplified and brought to tens and tens of millions of Americans, let alone billions of people around the world, really, really horrible content. And that's not even talking about what they've done to kids. So it is time that there's a fundamental overhaul of that law. It has to take respect for free speech and the First Amendment, but it is way past time that we overhauled Section 230 and really had a common sense framework about what internet platforms and the major media and social media and technology companies should be held accountable for on their platforms. They are publishers. In Bruce Reed's, in my opinion, they should be treated like publishers, just like the Washington Post and New York Times are, like ABC, CBS, and NBC are, like CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC are, and like radio stations. Except they're the biggest publishers in the world. Facebook has over 2 billion members. They're bigger than Christianity. So they should not be able to get off scot-free when all sorts of garbage is repeatedly on their platform every minute and affects our most important norms and institutions and our children. So period, full stop. We need to overhaul Section 230, and we need leaders like Senator Mark Warner and President-elect Joe Biden and their colleagues across the aisle on the Republican side to do that. So it is way past time that we reform Section 230 and also took on issues at the federal level like privacy, the digital divide, antitrust, et cetera. Big time.
So common sense legislation from the Common Sense Media head. That makes a lot of sense. And those are some very interesting points, Jim. I see that Mark Warner has joined us. Welcome, Mark. And I have to say, congratulations. I heard that Pelosi and Schumer endorsed your bipartisan bill of a $908 billion for COVID stimulus. I think that's great, with 10 billion, I heard, for broadband, I hope, for a lot of these issues of digital divide and what have you. But welcome. I'm glad. What prompted you to be part of this book, and why are the concerns so compelling now? Welcome, welcome. Good to see you.
April, thank you. And thanks for allowing me to join not only this forum with all my friends from Georgetown, but really to celebrate Jim's book. I mean, I'm proud to play a small part in it, but when Jim Steyer and Bruce Reed came and said they wanted to do this topic of which side of history you're on, it really grabbed my attention, because long before I was involved in politics, I was in the telecom business back in the early 80s when cell phones were the new hot thing, managed to do pretty well. And I really came into public service, first as governor and now as senator, with, I think, the view that many of us had, perhaps naively, that we were almost too robustly techno-optimists. We had this rare moment in time, particularly during the Obama administration, where you had the normal support for business that represents traditional Republican approach, and you had this kind of potentially, I would say from the Democratic side, somewhat naive belief that technology is going to be this great enabler. We all kind of bought into the notion that these platforms are going to be great community builders, and they have been great community builders in so many ways. But there was a deep, dark underbelly as well. I got exposed to that, particularly in my role as the vice chairman of the Intelligence Committee, where we saw Russia in particular be very successful at their manipulation of the American political process back in 2016, using platforms like Facebook and YouTube and others to spread disinformation and misinformation. It completely caught the American government and our intelligence agencies off guard. There was an enormous arrogance. I still remember Mark Zuckerberg's comment when I first raised the idea in mid-November of 2016 that the Russians may have been in our elections trying to help Donald Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton. Zuckerberg immediately dismissed it and said any politician who thinks that is, basically cuckoo. I think the facts potentially prove who was a little more out to lunch on these issues. And so I was happy to contribute. Anything that Jim and Bruce work on, I'm proud to be part of. I've worked with them on a lot of issues. And Jim obviously had been approaching this issue, as you know, April, serving on his board, about how these devices could be potentially disrupting our kids' lives. Long before there was the Social Dilemma film out there, Jim Steyer was sounding these alarms. And what I tried to do in my essay was recognize, first of all, this is not American-only phenomena. I like to point out that the Russian intervention in 2016 was also they also intervened in the Brexit vote. They also intervened in the French presidential elections. And if you add up all the Russians spent with misinformation and disinformation in those 3 elections, it was less than the cost of 1 new F-35 airplane. So this is both cheap and effective as a political tool. It is an issue that is being discussed in Washington way too slowly. Kudos again to Jim for the California privacy law. We've ceded traditional American leadership to Europe on both privacy and increasingly on content regulation, but it's also being discussed in Beijing, Moscow, and everywhere across the world, in the developing world as well. So how do we think about maintaining the good value of community building that comes with some of these platforms? How do we think about as well grappling with this dark underbelly, so being techno-realist, and recognize that the kind of unfettered, no regulatory approach that the United States has taken just isn't working. And in many ways, the technology platform companies took advantage of the dysfunction of where I work in the Congress for a number of years and kept thinking, well, no regulation, no regulation. I think it's going to come back and bite them, because when we do finally move, and I hope we will under the Biden administration early on move, they're going to end up with a much higher bar, not just in privacy. And I'll come back to 230 in a moment, although we'll get to another question, maybe I'll save 230. But there are a series of things even before we get to the 230 debate that I've been advocating. And I will just quickly.
That's kind of what I wanted to know. Like, what are your most pressing challenges that you see, given, both the Hill, the business side, and kind of the interconnection of this with big tech?
Well, again, maybe no regulation made sense when these were startups. Maybe no regulation made sense even on something like Section 230 in the late 90s when these were viewed as dumb pipes. There is nothing dumb about the Facebook algorithms at this point in terms of where it drives you at this moment in time. And the idea that when Facebook and Google, when 65% of Americans get all their news, some or all their news from those two sources, and to say they have no responsibility, I think that is naive. So I would break the buckets into 3 buckets. One, the privacy legislation, which we can come back to in a moment. On the other end, the content regulation in Section 230, and we can come back to that in a moment. Then there is this, how do we assess the enormous power of these companies? And I, again, Jim made this, I think these companies rival the trust that took place at the beginning of the 20th century that Teddy Roosevelt finally broke up. Rather than going, but where my position so far has been, rather going straight to antitrust regulation, are there other things we can do to increase competition? So I've got 3 or 4 bipartisan bills that I think would at least start that debate. First bill is called the Access Bill. It says, let's go ahead and allow data portability and interoperability. I'm an old telecom guy. Many of the students are probably too young to remember when it was a real pain in the ass to move from one telephone company to another. We made it simple with number portability, and suddenly that increased competition. What we're saying in the same ought to apply to the platforms. If you're tired about how Facebook treats you, you should be able to easily move all your data from your existing platform to NewCo and still be able to talk to people who still maintain their presence on the Facebook platform. So data portability, interoperability, old telecom concepts to bring about more portability. The Detour
privacy, access.
Well, let me just finish these 2 quick. Detour Act. How do we make sure we get rid of the manipulative dark patterns that all of these platforms use? How do we make sure that you don't? There's a place where you can actually decline something as opposed to simply click yes or learn more. How do we make sure that we, with the Dashboard Act, the 3rd place, we know what our data is worth. The most naive, and I think most Americans get this now, a couple years back they didn't, there's nothing free about Facebook and Google. They are great information suckers of our personal data. They then monetize it. There's nothing morally wrong with that, but we ought to have a right as Americans to know what that data is worth to these individual platforms so that potentially somebody could come in and disintermediate or another practice. So we'll get to content in a couple minutes, but I just wanted to share some of those bipartisan ideas that could increase competition. So privacy, increase competition, and then we can come to content later.
Those are fabulous. And Mark, I think that's right. You've been such a thought leader on the Hill in so many ways, and really a partner with across the aisle and in the Senate. And I think you've been really a visionary in terms of really working for the public interest and lifting up communications to serve, our kids and to really look at the manipulation of some of these algorithms. I'm just going to bring in Julie Cohen for a second, because Julia is Professor Cohen. She has a real deep expertise in terms of, copyright, intellectual property, but also just the internet in general. And I just kind of want to, because we are at Georgetown, other panelists have been talking about these different types of content, misinformation. We could even go with the essay that Jim wrote, even about some of the children's YouTube channels, and that they can be harmful to society and individuals. Of course, forcing these content obligations or platforms can lead us to these difficult questions about censorship and regulating speech. But given what the senator has just said, and thinking about, 230, but lifting up. Are there ways to address some of these challenges that don't really impact the content of the speech? And can we look at it creatively and more holistically?
Thank you, April, and it's a pleasure to be on this distinguished panel. So there's an old saying, if you have a hammer, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that comes from some work by a behavioral psychologist named Abraham Maslow, who was actually talking about the tendency that we all have when we're confronted with radically new challenging tasks to conform the contours of those tasks to the tools that we already know and are familiar with. We've been living through a dramatic change in our political economy. Everything seems to have been converted into flows of data and platformized. And we're trying to grapple with the appropriate legal and institutional responses to those changes. And they've disrupted a lot of the law that we thought we had and could rely on. And yet, in a way, when we think about how we should respond, it seems as though oftentimes we're still relying and leaning very heavily on the forms of existing legal institutions and taking our tool set for granted. And I don't think the problem of platform governance is going to be addressed by using those pre-existing regulatory tools. So let's think first really crisply about what platforms are. They're information intermediaries that use data-driven algorithmic methods and standardized modular interconnection protocols to facilitate networked interactions and network transactions among their users. And in particular, that's a fairly general definition, but the big platforms that we're grappling with today are organized around 4 more precise capabilities. They design interfaces that encourage sort of automatic habituated responses, and they use those interfaces to harvest really granular behavioral data. And harvest is the word, right? It's being cultivated. They process the data to create really strangely detailed and yet counterintuitive behavioral and psychometric profiles of users and user populations. They then monetize the profiles by offering other parties the opportunity to target content to receptive users. And then they engage in algorithmically mediated amplification of flows of content to receptive users and try to jack up user engagement, which increases the opportunity to monetize the flows. Now, we know this, right? Nothing I just said is a surprise. And yet when we go to regulate it, we are still sometimes reaching for those hammers and looking for the nails. So think about 2 hammers, right? Think about content regulation. Will we get traction on these activities and on disinformation flows by sort of blessing private platform processes organized around taking down particular items of content and calling that moderation? I don't think so, right? It's using a label of moderation to paper over a business model that's organized around immoderation. And it's, I see your finger, April, so 1 second. You need to have a set of tools that targets the micro-targeting, the data harvesting, the optimization for engagement, and the interface design for automatic habitual engagement, not by doing content moderation, and 230 is a red herring. Okay.
I really, it's
germane.
so interesting you say that, because, I talk about that a lot, and I'm going to send this back to Jim and Mark, because I do think there is something about pulling back the curtain in terms of, what are these algorithms that push and can manipulate. And I do like the detour legislation that you talked about, Mark, is really important. Is the impact of these algorithms really so broad that we need to have greater transparency into what's behind them, and look at that in terms of their impact, even though that might be proprietary for some companies? I might turn to Mark and then Jim to really kind of weigh in on that, because I think it's really important.
It's been interesting as I've, particularly with Facebook and some of these companies engaged, they move slowly. Like one of my first bills was the Honest Ads Act to say, is it really too much to ask to have a political ad that's on Facebook have the same disclosure requirements as an ad that appears on TV or on the radio? They moved on that. Then for a long time, they were like, oh my gosh, we can't really figure out data portability. Well, now they've moved on data portability. But they're not moving on valuation. They're not moving on things like the dark patterns. And Professor Cohen's comments about the algorithmic underpinnings that drive the addiction models. I mean, they will fight tooth and nail. They'll give up on 230 before they give up the underlying secret sauce. So I think Professor Cohen's right that we shouldn't simply bring a hammer, but we have been so slow and we to move on these that we have to at least threaten the hammer, or I think these folks will continue to string us along. And again, the social dilemma, I'm sure many of us have seen recently, maybe overstated in some places, but generally very, very true and accurate. And they will guard those algorithms much more than 230, much more than even valuation, because that really is the secret sauce. And at the end of the day, again, and I hope I will come back and give you some ideas on Section 230. I'll go to Jim next, but I do think one of so many of my Republican colleagues are really starting with the wrong premise. They think that the algorithms build political bias. I think they don't build any political bias. I think they reinforce extreme behavior, whether you move left or right. And that's their basic business model. And the professor said, unless we can get at that basic business model, we're going to be still mostly nibbling around the edges. Jim, do you want to?
And Jim, tech addiction and kids, I know you've talked about this.
I totally agree with what Mark said. First of all, we're sponsors of the Detour Act. It's a really good thing. We have been pushing the manipulative design issues with our colleagues. I mean, that movie that you're all referring to, Social Dilemma, came out of this campaign that we ran with Tristan Harris and Roger McNamee called the Social Dilemma, Truth About Tech. April, you were involved in it. Was the
great.
Which Side of History campaign. That's the successor to Truth About Tech and Social Dilemma. But few things. One, you have to hold these guys accountable. So you're absolutely right about the algorithms. Look at it from a kid's standpoint for a second. If you put your kid on YouTube or on Instagram, right? Your 5-year-old, and by the way, there are 5-year-olds and on YouTube and Instagram all the time. Millions and millions of little kids are on these platforms. They are driven from a little soft little Barney type video to porn and violence, 2 algorithmic clicks away. All of this then is denied responsibility by the companies. So a few things. One, they have to be accountable. So unless they fear either legal or regulatory punishment, and that includes sometimes, I think, the CEOs and the people who run the companies, they're just going to let it go. That's exactly what's happened. Facebook sat there, and Mark knows this. Bruce and I had a conversation with the people who run Facebook multiple times to their face, the absolute top executives, about Cambridge Analytica and the manipulation of the 2016 election. They did their normal strategy there: deny, deflect, distract. So here's the thing, April, you have got to hold these guys accountable. And so I don't agree with Julie Cohen that 230 is a red herring, because whether it's 230 or an overhaul it's really an overhaul of the whole way we look at this. And number two, in addition to holding them accountable for what's on the platforms, they are publishers. They're not just intermediaries. They are publishers, guys. And so they have to be treated that way. They are intermediaries, but they're also publishers, and all other publishers are held to a different standard. Second, the size of the companies is a huge deal. I actually think it's really positive that we're going to see antitrust cases against Google and Facebook. I actually think they will be better companies if they are broken up. We've publicly called for the divestiture of WhatsApp and Instagram from Facebook. I think that size issues matter because they go to the arrogance and the impenetrability of some of these companies. So we have to have a comprehensive tech agenda led by people like Senator Warner, both sides of the aisle. And they have to take, and Julie's absolutely right, you can't just rely on all the old mechanisms and old laws. This is a new era. But Washington, for the most part, with exceptions for people like Mark Warner and Ed Markey, were completely asleep at the switch for 15 years on this stuff. So we need to hold these guys accountable and be really specific about how they are responsible for the amplification of all those messages on their platform.
Okay, so let's get down to it though. How do you swipe right for your latte and use your ways and do all of these great things that technology has allowed us to have, but then also understand regulation and looking at 230 in terms of really how do we, and I'm going to turn to you, Mark, and then maybe if the professor wants to weigh in as well. I mean, what do you think realistically we could even do with Section 230 right now? And, a safe harbor. And particularly in instances where there's knowledge of bad actors doing bad things and victims have no right of redress. And I know I've talked about that with
Yeah.
several of you.
And I know Professor Cohen wants to talk. I just, and I want to make sure she gets plenty of time. I just apologize. I've got about 4 more minutes before I have to.
Okay, so
I have to
I'm
sign
gonna
off.
let you go
All
and
right,
then
and let
talk
me-
about your things
Well,
before
let me
you do
just,
it.
yeah, just.
And tell us about what you think is coming up
Okay,
in the next
all right.
session.
First of all, the idea that Section 230 is somehow this protection for small startups may have made some rational sense in the late 1990s. In 2020, it has been turned totally on the head. This area of concentration, because we don't have things like portability, we don't have the Detour Act, we don't have informed consumers around valuation, is some of the most concentrated monopolies that we face. And Section 230 is this shield to really, I think, in many ways, prevent competition, number one. Number two, I mean, Section 230 is not some, total immunity. We've already broken Section 230 in a variety of ways. We prohibited bomb making, we prohibited child pornography, we prohibited sex trafficking. So even in the United States, where we're very slow on these rules, we've shown that this is not a complete shield. And 3 and 4, 3 is anything on a going forward reform of Section 230, and I'm not fully at the place right now of junking it entirely. I'm not there yet, but any reform of 230 could still include protection for around startups. But I think there is a way, and the professor may want to weigh in on this. Is you have a right to say whatever you want, but that right doesn't necessarily mean it needs to get then amplified to 2 billion people with no responsibility. Speech and amplification, I believe, are two separate items. I think there are, you can have what we've seen with the Grindr case, where an individual was harassed and harangued with no protections at all, and Grindr used Section 230 as a protection against somebody who was in a broken up relationship and then was totally abused, sending people to this individual's door and harassment. There should be no enterprise of any business magnitude that should be protected against allowing personal harassment at the level that takes place right now with so many of these platforms. Number 3, nothing about these protections should give platforms the ability to violate civil rights laws. And I think there is a real growing recognition from the civil rights community, who oftentimes are also obviously protectors of the First Amendment, that the rules have been turned on their head with Section 230, where under Section 230, racist speech somehow becomes protected. I don't think that should be the case. Nothing as well should, frankly, around Section 230 prohibit on an international basis where there's not Section 230 protections. This is a uniquely American-only issue that should protect injunctive relief if the Myanmar are being slaughtered the Rohingya are being slaughtered in Myanmar, and if people can prove that on an international basis, I think that injunctive relief should not be provided or should not be prohibited. And then finally, even if you give all of the protections around actual speech, no one that I'm aware of, at least, and I did go to law school, I don't pretend to be a practicing lawyer in any way, thinks that protected speech falls into advertisements. There was a whole notion of part of the speech that powers these platforms that I think falls outside even most folks' vision of First Amendment protection. So I think and those are all short of where we may have to end up where Jim and Bruce are around the full notion of these entities as publishers. And I can end up there, I may end up there, but I'd like to see some of these other steps taken in the interim. And this is a debate, I know they've given me the hook, but they just last thing is, I do think that we may surprise some folks. I know if you watch the popular press, generally looking at the Biden administration, there's a lot of sense, well, tech policy doesn't seem to be high on that list. There are people, I hope, like Bruce Reed, who I hope will definitely go into the Biden administration. April, hope folks like you and others would go in, who I think will bring a tech agenda. This is one of the few areas that remain that is truly bipartisan. It is much less left versus right, conservative versus liberal, and more future versus past. And I think as a Democrat, the Democrats have been at their best when they've been future leaning. And I look forward to that debate. And we might actually surprise a lot of folks by both the Biden administration having a robust tech agenda and it actually being embraced in a broadly bipartisan way.
Those are fabulous points. And as always, you are so sage, and I love the balance. And the devil is in the details, but I think that you have struck the right balance. And I do believe forward leaning is the exact right thing. Just tell me, because I know you only have a little bit more. Tell me, what do you think should be the
Can
priority?
I jump in with 2 quick points, please?
Sure.
Yeah, I just want, because I want to jump in on the point about it's the amplification, right? It's so critical what the senator said. It's the amplification, but not, and that makes them publishers. When you say they're not intermediaries, they're publishers, you are reaching for a different hammer, right? And the hammer you're reaching for is media policy, and publishers have extensive protections that don't come from 230 because they come from elsewhere, right? They come from the First Amendment, they come from media regulation. They're not publishers, right? They're intermediaries that use algorithms to optimize flows to extract surplus from data, right? It is not media policy that you want to use here, right? And the idea that the proprietary algorithms are immune from scrutiny is another red herring. Right? It's not media. It's like the Clean Air Act or airbag policy.
Hey, Julie, I think that the senator has to leave in like about 1 or 2 minutes. Is that
absolutely,
what I'm hearing, Mark? I want to delve in on that and go right back to that as soon as I just want to ask him one quick question before he has to sign off, and then I totally want to hear that because I hear what you're saying. Mark, tell me, because I know that you have to get off, what do you think the priorities of the 117th Congress will be? What would you like to see in terms of kind of if you could triage? And I know that privacy was a big one that you mentioned before.
Well, privacy, listen, we should have already done, we should have already done privacy. And frankly, the only remaining issue in many ways is, what kind of right of action do you have? And there ought to be a bipartisan way to sort through that, whether that's at the state level or the private right of action. I do think some of these issues around pro-competition around the platforms are, they are not giant steps, they are medium-sized steps. But I would try those before I go through full bore breakup, because I am still concerned these are global markets and I don't want them replaced by Chinese tech companies. I think there will be, and I think this is broader than our discussion today, but I do think there is an enormous challenge vis-a-vis China as China continues, on platforms, on 5G, on artificial intelligence, on quantum computing. Increasingly, China is setting the rules, procedures, protocols for all of these new technologies. This was something that used to be inherently American-driven, and oftentimes our values came through those rules, procedures, protocols, transparency, human rights, other issues. And as bad as some of the things that are happening right now with our existing platforms, it is exponentially worse if we see a Chinese Communist Party dominated technology-driven world, both from a competitive standpoint and from a national security standpoint. So much more.
Thomas Padron, one of our Georgetown JD candidates, acts just like that. He said, just asked that question, and he said, how do we remain competitive? What steps can we do?
Well, I think on competition, we have to acknowledge, I think what the Chinese Communist Party has done is they've taken the best ideas from British imperialism and American imperialism, and they've created what I would call authoritarian capitalism, where there is ferocious competition in the Chinese domestic market until a national champion emerges. That national champion then gets 75% of the Chinese market, which translates to 15 to 20% of the global market. Then that Chinese national champion gets basically unlimited financing. And with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, where they've got a series of almost, I wouldn't call them satellite countries, but just as we had our sphere of influence, they at least have an economic sphere of influence. Those companies then have a business plan that's tough for any, not just American or Western company can compete with. So we're going to need both, I think, more government investment not picking winners and losers, but at least in terms of what would be referred to as industrial policy, whether it's around semiconductors or around 5G to 6G, O-RAN networks, where we can build and maintain our advantage. And I say that can't be done American only. It needs to be an alliance of the willing. And that ought to be amongst democracies around the world. And this technology-based alliances, I almost think it's the 21st century version of what used to be military alliances, and then there were trade pacts. I think the 21st century is going to bring about technology alliances. And I think as long as we have kind of our basic rule of law and values embedded in those alliances, that will keep us both competitive and also, I think, on a multilateral basis ahead of the curve. On that note, I'm signing off.
Thank you, Mark. Those were really great insights, and I really appreciate
And I see Bruce Reed finally got here.
Oh my gosh.
Mark, it's Bruce. Look who's here.
Hey, Bruce. Hey, Julie, I'll let you go back to your comment. Thank you, Mark. I really
Thanks, guys.
appreciate those insights. You can finish up, and then I'm gonna start with Bruce. Welcome, Bruce. Thank you. I'm sorry, Julie, I did not mean to cut you off. Please go ahead.
I think we should hear from Bruce.
I agree.
All right.
You're on the spot, big boy.
Okay, Bruce. So tell us how are you, first of all? And thank you for joining us. I know it's been like quite a busy time for you right now. But hey, just starting. I mean, tell us. We've been talking about 230. We've been lifting up about the entire book and all of the interconnection and holistically looking at which side of history. Tell us like what you think is going to happen, because you're billed as one of the, top tech advisors to President-elect Biden. Tell us what you think in terms of a tech agenda going forward. What do you think might happen in the next 100 days, the next 2 years, and where do you think the priority should be?
Well, let me answer the last part of that question. I don't want to speak for the transition of the new administration, but just give a sense of where the country is and what needs to be done. I think there's a emerging consensus that it's long past time to hold the big social media platforms accountable for what's published on their platforms, the way we do newspaper publishers and broadcasters. It's time to make sure that workers and communities and small businesses have a fair shot and don't get swept aside by either the march of technology or the concentration of power. And that, we all recognize the enormous promise of technology, but we can't sit back and let the fourth industrial revolution cast the American worker aside and gut the middle class. And I think Jim, I'm sure, has already talked about it, but one of the real bright spots of the past few years, which I think shows the true balance of power here, is what has happened in California. When we set out to pass the California Consumer Privacy Act in big tech's backyard, it felt like taking on the railroads in the 1890s. Nobody thought we could pass anything. We were outnumbered in the halls of the Capitol in Sacramento 10 or 20 to 1 by industry representatives. But we had one thing going for us, which is that we had an initiative that had qualified for the ballot that we could hold over the legislature's head. And the industry and the legislators knew that if they didn't agree to something good, the people of California would do it for them. And so they ultimately threw in the towel. We passed a great bill. And the CCPA passed the California legislature in both houses unanimously. And even this year, in what I think even Jim would admit was a tough year for initiatives out in California, we passed another one to strengthen it. And that passed handily. So yeah, I think that we shouldn't be daunted by what we see in the political landscape. There's broad interest in both parties and enormous interest in the countryside for taking up these issues. People don't trust platforms like Facebook with the future of their democracy. They don't trust big tech with their innermost secrets. They don't know how to get their privacy back, but they want it back. And I think sooner or later, and probably sooner, the political world is going to recognize that and act on it. And look, if Donald Trump can read Jim and my chapter and come out with a veto threat that demands Section 230, then we must be making progress. We should have written more chapters on other issues.
Oh my goodness. Well, you know, it's funny you say that, Bruce, because we had 5 questions from alums and from students all about federal privacy. If we were going, if California Prop 24 would get us a new federal privacy law. And in fact, a couple of people, students, and Angela Ball from NBC Universal said, will a new federal agency be created to regulate social media platforms? And would some of these invoke privacy issues? So interesting questions that do you think it'll be a priority going forward?
I think all of these tech issues have to be a priority because they're at the heart of our economy. They're at the at the edge where the future is causing some good things and some real pain. And Washington's going to have to get organized to deal with them. Europe has done that. We're going to have to do the same. Figure out what is the best way to regulate this industry. Where are the areas where we can get stuff done quickly, and what can we learn from what Europe has done, what California is doing, and what else do we need to try?
You know, April, just one thing to add, and I'm sure Julie has other stuff to add too, to what Bruce is saying is the idea that the industry is going to self-regulate, which is pretty much what was bought into for more than a decade, is just a joke. It is not, and they're not. And by the way, we can disagree, and there's going to be a robust discussion we were just having on with Julie, really about 230 and how to take care of that, or how we're going to deal with competition / antitrust issues. Obviously there should be a federal privacy law that it uses the California structure as a floor, not a ceiling. Obviously we have to solve the digital divide. And Mark said something really important about tech infrastructure. And this is a jobs creation. This is an extraordinary opportunity at a time to invest and schools creation, right? As every parent knows and teacher knows in the pandemic, there's a chance actually to use technology to transform education in a really positive way. So I actually think, because there's so many other things on the agenda, that Bruce is absolutely right. There is going to be tremendous movement forward. And Mark kept saying it would be bipartisan. I agree with him, even if people come from different ideological platforms or places. There is a huge opportunity, and it will happen in the next couple of years. And to Julie's good points, you're going to have to think about this issue. There's going to be specific discussions we're going to have to have. We're going to have to honor old principles and things we hold dear, but also build new structures that are relevant to 2020, not 1920. But there's a huge, and the fact that Georgetown is a leader on this, the law school, is fabulous, because you guys are going to be having a huge platform at Georgetown Law School to talk about these issues. But I think we're in a really positive place, April, if we keep our eye on the ball and people like Bruce help steer the ship.
So 1 or 2 audience questions, and then I think we're going to have to wrap it up. But a couple, interesting what you both said about, information, data. We had almost 4 or 5 questions asking if we should reestablish the Office of Technology Assessment with the Library of Congress to help develop well-reasoned and independent analysis of tech-related policies. That might be something as well. I mean, any support, or have you thought about that? But several people are saying, hey, do we want to start looking for more information in this arena?
Well, I think just generally, there's enormous interest, enthusiasm around the country for getting back to promoting science and technology. And I'd say that Joe Biden's biggest applause line on the stump in the campaign was that we believe in science, not fiction. There's a hunger for that for lots of reasons related to the pandemic, but also I think everyone recognizes that this is going to be a century where what we invest in technology, what we invest in science, whether we trust the scientists, elevate them, give them the place they should have, and whether Jim's exactly right about broadband. That is an incredible unifying issue that has not just bipartisan support, but urban and rural support. And
And
it
$10
will,
billion was in the budget with the Warner, the COVID stimulus package that was, I guess today came out that there was
yeah, that's right. And it is,
allocation within that COVID package.
you know, it's as we've seen, it's a life and death matter when it comes to telemedicine. It's an economic life and death matter for lots of small communities, and it's an incredible engine of opportunity, both in actually laying the broadband, but even more so, what the doors that it opens for the heartland, and as Jim said, in closing the digital divide in the city as well.
So last question, title of the book, what side of history are we going to move in the right direction with current policy proposals? And what do you think? When do you think we're going to get to? Do you think we'll get to a point where we can look back and be proud of where we are?
Well, let's let Julie go first. Julie, what do you think?
It depends a lot on the direction that is taken. I deeply respect the impulse that led to the California privacy law, but I'll be very surprised if it moves the needle by itself, because it makes so much hinge on consent and on rights that individual consumers can choose or not choose to assert. And so many forces are driving the other direction. I continue to think that we're reaching for hammers, right? So consent is another one, just like treating platforms as publishers and activating media policy is another hammer. I think we need a new regulatory agency tasked to oversee platforms, tasked to, and you know, we can be creative here, right? There's a whole toolkit that they use in financial regulation for benchmarking and stress testing algorithmic functions. I would dearly love to see legislation that learned from the FinReg toolkit and worked specifically on the problem of algorithmic oversight. If that came out of the first 100 days of the Biden administration, to answer another question in the chat, I would be so very happy.
Bruce, you want to go second?
Good insights.
We're definitely on the right side of history, but you know, it's going to be a race. It's not. We can't stand still here. So I think I'm really optimistic about it because, you know, like the basic values of accountability and responsibility and opportunity and privacy are fundamental American values that are going to be difficult to take away and certainly impossible to take away for long.
And you know, April, first of all, I think thank you for talking about which side of history. That is the idea. Is I think we really have to ask this to all the CEOs of these companies who are so perhaps the most powerful group of CEOs, certainly in our lifetimes. And I think the comparison to the Trust era and the Teddy Roosevelt era is absolutely spot on. I think I'm with Bruce totally. I am really optimistic that this is going to move forward in a really constructive way. And as Julie said, it's going to be complicated and we're going to have to be really smart about not using hammers all the time and building new tools to assess it. But when I wrote back in 2012, talking back to Facebook, April, I felt like I was
Remember
in
that
wilderness with the snow on the ground and snowflakes falling on the ground. And I mean, let me tell you, it pissed off Mark and Cheryl and everybody at Facebook. But my own children told me at the time that privacy was passé. It didn't matter, that dad was too old. He is too old, by the way, but that we had moved beyond all these things. Now, as Julie just mentioned, Bruce said, the public gets this. We are going to have to be very careful in how we craft some of these laws and regulations. I absolutely agree, Julie. We're going to need new forms of regulatory agencies and structures to deal with 21st century problems. Now, we have antiquated structures in place. And part of that is going to be up to the Biden administration to be inventive and innovative. And by the way, we're going to have to work with the tech industry. I think it's really important to say that this is actually in the long-term best interest of the tech industry itself. And they are not monolithic. One of the things Bruce and I know very well from our experiences in California and in Washington is that Apple is not aligned with where Facebook is on most issues, nor is Microsoft and Google or Salesforce or HP. So this is this huge industry that's the most dominant industry here in the US and globally. There are going to be incredibly important opportunities to frame this for the best interests of kids and families and consumers. And I believe that not only should you go buy a copy of Which Side of History, but that we are going to end up on the right side of history. And if we have to drag some of the tech leaders along with us, so be it, but we're going to end up there. And I think the Biden administration is going to be really, really smart about this.
So thank you, Julie. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Bruce. And thanks to Senator Warner, who's no longer here. Thank you for participating today. There's a link for which side of history. And as Hillary Brill at the Institute said, it's how it's shaping us, but how we shape it back and we use it to lift up and allow media, communications, and technology to really serve society for the better and in our public interest. So I appreciate it all. Thank you all. And thank you, Georgetown. And congratulations on your 150th anniversary. And thank you for joining. Take care.